All right, Vipal, we'll come back to you here. We're going to go to Rahim Mohammed with the National Post next here. Rahim, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me, Premier Smith? Can you hear me, Sam?
Sure can. Sure can. Hi,
Hi,
Rahim.
Premier Smith. I apologized. I missed part of your opening statement. There were some technical difficulties on my end. I apologize if this was addressed. But were you able to obtain any assurances from the president-elect, Mr. Trump, on the 25% tariffs that are slated to come in now in under a month?
I think we need to be prepared that tariffs are coming. That seems to me to that the I mean I think we've all seen the biggest irritant to the United States are trade deficits, which they believe they have. I don't actually believe they have a trade deficit. When you take out energy, we actually buy more goods and services from the U.S. than they buy from us. I'm happy to make this national bank report available to anyone who wants it. That shows we actually have $58 billion in a trade deficit with the Americans when you take energy out. And that's why I wanted to have the assurance that the Americans are interested in getting more of our oil and gas, because I think oil and gas is going to be key to being able to get a breakthrough once tariffs do come in getting them off. I think if we maintain a strong partnership on energy, we make the case about how much the Americans benefit from that energy relationship. We demonstrate that we are a good trade partner, that we buy more goods and services from America than any other nation, and that we do buy more goods and services when you take energy out. I think we can make that case, but I feel like from what I have seen that it's not my decision to make on tariffs, but we do need to be preparing ourselves for the fact that they're likely to come in on January 20th.
So in any of your discussions with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, did you either raise the topic of the tariffs, or did the question of the tariff and their potential impact on Canada's economy did that come up in discussion?
Yeah.
You and the president?
Well, clearly, I mean, what I've been hoping to do with all of my media appearances and interactions with the administration and various other incoming officials is to argue why we should continue to have a tariff-free relationship between the U.S. and Canada. And I think that the bedrock of that tariff-free relationship is energy. I think that when you talk about how we export, and I think that the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, made this point recently, we actually sell discounted oil to the U.S. They upgrade it. So $100 billion worth of Canadian exported oil turns into $300 billion worth of value-added product and exports that the U.S. can then use with their trade partners around the world. So I just feel like the more we make those arguments, slowly but surely, we'll be able to make the case that we should continue to enjoy a tariff-free relationship. But I don't want to raise any expectations. The administration, the president gets sworn in, becomes president on January 20th. As I have understand, from reading the papers, there's 100 executive orders coming in there, and I haven't seen anything that suggests that he's changing course. So our job is going to be to work overtime to make sure that we can make the case for carve-outs if that potential does happen. And I think an obvious way of making the argument is to be talking about this important energy relationship. So I wanted to begin that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. Thank you, Rahim. We'll come back to you now, Vipal, if you're able to unmute yourself. If not, I'll just read out your question that you put into the chat if you want to try here. And seeing none, I'll read your question from the chat here. So, Premier, from Bhopal, how does PM Trudeau's resignation affect talks? Is Canada's response to the tariff threat being coordinated, or is there a concern about a leadership vacuum?
I'm very concerned about a leadership vacuum. That's why I've been calling for an immediate election, because we need somebody at the table who is able to engage with the administration saying, you've got a 4-year mandate, I got a 4-year mandate, let's deal. And we don't have that right now. And what I'm hoping is that that we don't damage the relationship in these final few months before we have an election. So I'm beginning my own conversations with the U.S. administration I hope that we're able to get past these immediate problems, but I think we've got such a solid base to start on. But there is no question it would be far better if we had an immediate election so that we had whoever it was at the table able to have that strong four-year mandate.
Thank you, Premier. Now we'll go to Robert Tuttle with Bloomberg. Robert, you should be able to unmute yourself now, and then next we'll go to David Staples. And are you there, Robert? All right. I can't hear from Robert. We'll go next here to David Staples. David, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me, Premier? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yesterday, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly talked about, she was asked specifically if in negotiations with Trump, Canada would consider an energy embargo on the United States. And I want to, as leverage, what do you think, what do you make of what she said?
Well, first of all, it's oil and gas that's owned by the provinces, principally Alberta, and we won't stand for that. And you should never, ever threaten something you cannot do. And I would encourage the minister to look at a map of where Line 5 goes. Line 5 comes down through Michigan to get to Sarnia. And then that feeds the bulk of the supply needed for Ontario and connects with Line 9, which feeds the bulk of the product needed for Quebec. And so if you cut off that line, you are cutting off Ontario and Quebec. So I would encourage the ministers to either understand how our integrated pipeline system works and start looking at ways that we would be able to practically respond, because there's no point in making empty threats that cannot be executed on. So there are other things I'm sure that that we'll all talk about collectively, but let's just remember how integrated our markets are with the Enbridge system, the TC Energy system, that we have a product going back and forth across the border every single day. And we cannot do anything that harms Canadians in such a substantial way. So I just don't take that as a credible threat. I'm sure that the US administration won't either. So we should talk about things that we actually can do as opposed to empty threats.
If they were to proceed down that path for some reason, what would be Alberta's response?
Well, they will have a national unity crisis on their hands at the same time as having a crisis with our US trade partners. We just won't stand for that. And I don't think Ontarians and Quebec should stand for that as well. They shouldn't be standing by and listening while a federal minister talks about cutting off their energy supply. That's just not on. That makes no sense.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Premier. And I see actually we missed the Vipal Munga's follow-up here. So Vipal Munga, Wall Street Journal, how does the Premier feel about the idea of an export tax?
There's going to have to be some kind, if a 25% tariff comes in across the board on all of our goods, there will have to be a Canadian response. My efforts are to try to avoid that altogether. I feel like it would be mutually damaging to have 25% tariffs across the board on US goods coming into Canada. That would harm Canadian citizens at a time when we have an affordability crisis, in the same way that a 25% tariff across the board on our goods to the US will harm US citizens, some more than others. There are some states whose refineries, we've got 50 refineries that rely on Canadian oil. Those states are going to suffer the biggest increase in gasoline prices. So which is also an objective of the administration, is to keep energy costs low. So I hope cooler heads prevail. I hope we're able to make the case that taking out energy, Canada actually has the trade deficit. We're a good partner. We buy a lot of goods from the United States, more than any other jurisdiction, and we should maintain this tariff-free relationship for the benefit of both of us. That's what I hope is the outcome. But and that's what I'll keep continuing to argue until we see what actually happens on January the 20th.
Thank you, Premier. And then for Robert Tuttle from Bloomberg, he put his question in the chat. Did Trump indicate that he would exclude oil and gas from tariffs, given that he wants to approve Keystone XL pipeline?
Well, I wanted to gauge their interest in buying more oil and gas, and it seemed to me that the president was interested in his response. As you recall, on January 6th, we did a press conference with Enbridge where we have an agreement in principle to secure space on new lines so that we can build more capacity to the United States. I'm excited about that. I'm looking forward to seeing other pipeline companies come forward with that. And I was encouraged that there does seem to be an understanding on the part of the president about how we might be able to get more oil and gas to the United States. So I think that's some common ground to start from once the new administration comes in. And that's part of the reason why I'm building the relationships that I am, is that whatever short-term issues that we have right now, we have a long-term relationship with the United States that is going to be incredibly successful, that will result in us being able to build more pipeline access, I think. And I think I would like to see those conversations start very soon.
Thank you, Premier. And Robert, if you had a follow-up, feel free to throw it in the chat. While we wait for that, we're going to go to Mikey Jurgic with the Globe and Mail. Mikey, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I think you mean Mickey Judich with Politico, but I will take the question. Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Premier. Did you secure any promises or assurances from Trump that he will exempt Alberta oil and gas from 25% tariff?
No, I'm not expecting any exemptions. I'm expecting that we're going to have a lot of work to do in arguing why this special relationship that we have with the United States and have had since the 90s should continue. And that's what I'm doing, is just making the case, especially about energy, which is, I think it's number one, it's our largest export, but also the Americans benefit because we sell it at a discount, benefits their consumers by having lower prices, allows them to export higher priced WTI to get higher value for it. We think we can be the solution to not only American energy affordability, but also American energy dominance. And so that's the deal that I want to make with the United States. And we have to get through the inauguration, see what the response is on tariffs. But I'm going to continue advancing that, and we'll see if we can have that energy partnership form the basis of a new relationship with the United States.
And what do you think of Canada imposing a 25% retaliatory tariff on oil and gas exports and other non-Alberta energy like uranium and electricity to the US if that does become necessary?
Well, I hope it doesn't become necessary. Obviously, there'll have to be a response, and I think we have to look at what the decision is in the first place. I mean, I keep hearing different news stories about what products might or might not be targeted. I don't know if you've got any more information than I've seen in the media. It doesn't. If it's across the board, that would require one response. If it's targeted towards particular types of products, that would require another response. But I don't think it's helpful to negotiate that in public. I think that we have to take the president seriously. We have to wait and see what he does. And then we have to have a measured and mature response to it that hopefully does not damage the relationship or damage Canadian consumers and Canadian businesses too much. So I don't want to prejudge what that's going to look like, because I think we've seen a couple of different stories that suggest it might be across the board, it might be targeted. I don't think we really know until January 20th, and we'll have a conversation, I believe, on January 15th with all of the premiers and the representatives of the federal government to see what those various outcomes might be. But I'm of the view that we should be able to maintain a tariff-free relationship with the U.S., and I hope we can work towards that again.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Mickey. Next, we'll go to Heather Euro-West with Global News, and then after that, we'll go to Chris Sparko. Heather, feel free to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for taking my question. Looking for your response to criticism that by advocating for an energy carve-out, you might be undermining, the position of other premiers or Canada more broadly, looking to avoid tariffs altogether.
Well, I'm hoping that by talking about the importance of energy, that we'll be able to avoid tariffs on every Canadian product. I mean, Alberta has a huge agriculture sector. We've got timber that we want to export. We've got manufactured goods increasingly. So, it doesn't help Alberta to have tariffs on any of our products either. I just feel that energy becomes the way that we make the case for why we should maintain a tariff-free relationship on all products. I haven't been arguing for a particular carve-out. I've been talking about how energy should be. When I said if we take energy out of the picture in making the argument, we have a the Americans have a trade surplus with us. That's an argument that I think should allow us to say that we should continue to avoid have a tariff-free relationship, because they need our energy. They are producing 13 million barrels a day, but they consume 21 million barrels a day. They've got to get additional oil and gas resources from somewhere. We're already integrated. We already are their principal partner in providing that resource to reduce the cost for their consumers. And there aren't very many good options to get heavy oil from elsewhere. They can get it from Venezuela and Iran and Iraq, and I think we're a much better partner than that. So I would say I'm looking at using our energy relationship in a different way than I'm hearing other Canadian leaders talk about it. I'm talking about using the basis of our strong energy relationship as the reason why we shouldn't have tariffs on any of our Canadian products. I hope that's not unclear.
And just as a follow, wondering if you could shed some light on how this meeting came about, how you got the invitation, and if there was any payment required for access to the president-elect.
There was no payment, and I was a guest of Kevin O'Leary. As you know, Kevin O'Leary has a significant a business announcement that he made in our province a couple of months ago. He wants to build a $70 billion data center. And so I'm encouraged by the confidence that he's showing in the Canadian market and in Alberta in particular. And so he invited me to join him.
Great. Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Heather. Next, we'll go to Chris Sparko. Chris, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Premier. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Premier, what was the discussion that you had with the president-elect on pipelines, specifically around getting Keystone XL or other pipelines built, and what was President-elect Trump's response?
Well, it was a social gathering, and so we had an opportunity. My objective was to gauge his interest in continuing to have more oil and gas from Canada and Alberta in particular come into the United States, and that was my objective, and I was pleased to see a positive response. And so I would say that the future discussions about particular pipelines are going to likely be had with his administration. Remember, right now we're in this strange position in the U.S. where all the department officials work for the Biden administration, and as of January 20th, with some key changes and key appointments that we would anticipate being made fairly soon, that's when we can really begin the conversation about how we might be able to increase pipeline access across the board. Enbridge has one proposal. I understand other pipeline companies are coming forward with other proposals, and we're going to take them all to the United States administration. And so that work really begins in earnest once the confirmations have taken place and the various secretaries are in place.
Premier, you mentioned the fact that we need to be prepared as Canadians to see tariffs imposed after January 20th. So what is Alberta doing to prepare for that? What is plan B look like for Alberta if tariffs are imposed on energy?
As I've said before, I think tariffs are their own punishment. Putting a 25% tariff on Alberta oil and gas increases costs for American refineries and ultimately American consumers. You've got 50 refineries that accept Canadian oil, and many of those only accept Canadian oil. That's going to have a direct impact on not only those refiners, but their customers. And so I would hope that we'd be able to make the argument that we could avoid that altogether. That's what I will be continuing to do. But I think that the strategy on how we respond, I don't think that should be discussed in public. I think that we'll have to discuss that as a group and see how they end up getting levied on the 20th, and then have a response prepared at that time. But my efforts up till this point and up until tariffs come in are going to be to try to make the case why Canada should have this special relationship, and we should avoid them altogether.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Chris. We have time for 2 more questions. We're going to go to Tyler Dawson with the National Post next, and then our last question will be from Rick Bell. Tyler, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I have to admit, I'm tempted to ask about Sylvester Stallone, but that seems like it would burn a valuable question.
He looks just like he does in the movies.
That's good for Sylvester. Good for him. You'd hinted a little bit earlier that if there is some sort of export ban on Alberta oil, that would precipitate a national unity crisis. From your perspective as Premier of Alberta, what does that look like, other than, I don't know, people being mad in the streets? Or is it a separation referendum? Like, what are we talking about when you say national unity crisis?
Well, I can't predict what Albertans would do, but as you know, the part of my strategy over the last 2 years has been to say that we can have a constructive relationship with Canada. And I would hope that would continue to be the case. Here's the thing I find irritating about Eastern politicians making that argument. The reason I find it irritating is because we could have had Energy East, which would have expanded our ability to support our friends in Eastern Canada and also been an export market off the East Coast. We could have had Northern Gateway, which would have expanded and supported export markets in a more substantial way off the West Coast. And Eastern politicians advocated against those things. And so we went to work on expanding our access to the United States with additional egress, with twinning, with looping. We did that because the rest of the country wasn't interested in having that conversation. So to now make the argument that that's a point of leverage is going to be very, very irritating, not only to me, but also to my fellow Albertans. If they want to start the conversation by saying, gosh, maybe we should have had Energy East and Northern Gateway, let's restart that so that we're not so dependent on one customer, I am more than happy to have that conversation. And I hope that's where the conversation goes. But having been so hostile to Alberta's interests and having canceled so many important projects that would have allowed us to have a diversified customer base, it's outrageous to me that they would even propose it.
And my follow-up, sort of picking up on what Chris had asked about what Alberta's response might be, and you said you don't want to discuss potential options. I guess, how do you reassure Albertans that you have a response after January 20th, or that they're not going to be beggared by a tariff war in the next couple of years?
I think you'll see what happens on January the 15th. We've got Doug Ford is the head of the Council of the Federation, and so he has been doing a lot of media and a lot of commentary. You'll see as well whoever emerges as the principal voice on trade. At the moment, it seems to be Jolie, but it has in the past been Dominic, and so I'm still a little unclear on who is going to be the voice at the table. I hope to get some clarity on that this week. But I think we need to to hash this out and really understand what the pressure points are and what the solutions are. As I said, I mean, I think the solution is that we find ways to buy more American goods, and that seems to me to be the very logical step that we should take. So I'll put that on the table. I know that there's lots of American products that we want to buy. We want to build more natural gas power plants. We want transformers. We want to build out AI data centers, hopefully with the supply chain from the United States. I think we've got a good story to tell about how we might be able to increase the amount that we buy. We buy lots of food products that come across from the United States. Maybe there's a way to buy more and bring down the cost of groceries in Alberta and Canada. So I would say that's a more constructive conversation about how do we buy more from the Americans, if that's the real pressure point, as opposed to getting into a tariff war. We have to remember the Americans' economy is 10 times the size of ours. And the amount that we export to them is a much smaller share of their overall economy. It's a much larger share of ours, and so we are the ones who are really harmed if we try to get into any kind of prolonged trade and tariff war. So I would say that we know that the president's opening position. We've got to try to find a way to dig down and get to a resolution, and I think that will have to happen in earnest once the inauguration happens on January 20th.
Thank you, Premier, and thank you, Tyler. We have time for one last question. That'll be from Rick Bell. Rick, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And are you there, Rick? Let's see if you should be able to unmute yourself now. I'll give you a minute. And seeing that, all right, that's not going to work, Rick. Sorry, I'll take one last question here. We're going to go to Emma Graney from the Globe and Mail. Emma, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, g'day, Premier. How's it going?
Good, thank you.
Excellent. You sound kind of resigned to the fact there will be tariffs. I think that would be kind of fair to say at this point. So how do you minimize damage to Alberta's sector in terms of plans going forward that your government can do here in Alberta to minimize that damage?
I'll have to talk with industry about that. I want to see the way in which the tariffs are levied, if indeed they do come through on January the 20th. But I would hope that we could make an argument about how we might get them removed very quickly. That would be my hope. But I don't want to prejudge what that's going to look like. But I haven't seen any indication in any of the president's public commentary or even in the comments that he had with me that he's inclined to change his approach. So I think we have to be prepared for what that's going to look like. And remember, any kind of retaliation that we do on tariffs hurts Canadians. Let's be frank about that. That is that if we put across the board 25% tariffs in place on American goods, that makes the cost of everything for Canadians more expensive. So this is why tariff wars are so painful. Is that you end up hurting yourself in trying to retaliate. And so we have to be very thoughtful about how we go about doing that. And that's going to be part of the conversation, I think, on January 15th when we all get together with the First Ministers meeting.
Sorry, I mean, is there anything your government can do in Alberta specifically to kind of avoid damage if it does come down the line? I mean, would you think about supporting the industry in a monetary sense or anything along those lines, or is it too early to say?
Well, I think we'd have to be prepared that we would run deficits in Alberta. I mean, remember, one of the potential consequences is that the gap on Western Canada Select increases again. We've been delighted to see it narrow. It got down to $12. It's been as high as $30, but every dollar that Western Canada Select is sold at a discount. It costs our treasury, I believe, $600 million. So So that's one of the consequences that we would have, and that's one of the things that we'd have to take a closer look at how we would be able to manage. I'd have to do more if it's on agriculture. That would require a different type of response. If it's on any of our manufactured goods, again, I'd have to talk to industry about what they would hope to be as a response. I think what we would all hope is that we would be able to resolve it very quickly, so that the damage to both of our economies is minimal. But there aren't good consequences when you talk about a 25% across the board tariff. That's painful for our exporters, and a retaliatory 25% tariff is painful for our consumers. And that's why we want to do what we can to get the relationship back on track, address the pressure points and the trade irritants in a meaningful way, and hopefully be able to get any tariffs that are levied removed as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Premier. And Rick, I'll give you another chance to try and unmute yourself here. If not, that'll most likely conclude today's press conference then. All right. And hearing nothing, then that's where we'll end today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Premier.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sam.